Good
Good
evening
evening
and
and
welcome to
welcome to
another
another
episode of
episode of
Territory
Territory
Talk.
Talk.
I am
I
your
am
guest
your guest
host,
host,
Shana Smith
Smith Smith
Archer.
Archer.
And with me
And
this
with me this
evening
evening
is Miss
is Miss
Shirley
Shirley
Osborne.
Osborne.
Apologies
Apologies
from
from
our other
our other
co-host,
co-host,
Chris
Chris
Famous.
Famous.
And
And won't
I'm
be,
sure he'll
I'm
be
sure he'll be
listening but
listening
not
but
participating
participating
tonight.
tonight.
So
So
before we
before
get
we get
started, I
started,
just want to
just want to
acknowledge
acknowledge
our
our
media
media
partners,
partners,
Cayman Marl
Cayman
Road
Marl Road
Facebook,
Facebook,
Radio
Radio
TCI,
TCI,
Montserrat
Montserrat,
ZJB
ZJB
Radio,
Radio,
Virgin
Virgin
Islands
Islands
TBN
TBN
Radio,
Radio,
FN
FN
90.9,
90.9,
Bermuda's
Bermuda's
Channel
Channel
82,
82,
and
and
Radio
Radio
Saba,
Saba,
the
the
PJFE
PJFE,
FM
FM
93.9.
93.9.
All
All
right,
right,
over to
over
you
to you
tonight, Shirley,
tonight,
to
Shirley, to
introduce our
introduce
guest.
our guest. All right, thank you, Shayna. Good evening to you, and good evening to all our media partners, and good evening also to our guests, Ms. Missick, the Honorable Akierra Missick from Turks and Caicos. Hi, Akierra. It's so good to see you again.
You as well,
You as well,
Shirley.
Shirley. And then we have Mr. John Barritt, former member of Parliament from Bermuda, who is. It is so good to see you again, John. It's so good to. I met you 2 weeks ago, and now we're talking again. I like that.
Yes,
Nice.
good.
So let me just jump right in, because when we met the last time, we were talking about the submissions that are moving in, that have been requested from what the British people call PACAC, the Public Administration and Constitution Affairs Committee. Submissions were due on on Monday, the 4th, right? And so I'm assuming that they're all in. And every month that we asked for time, because some things were just running too late, people sending in submissions and so on. So a couple of people in months that asked for a time, and we got extensions. But I want to ask you, before we jump into the issues themselves, I want to ask, there's this Englishman I know who used to live in Montserrat and was very involved in life on the island. And he says that the Public Affairs and Public Administration Constitution Affairs Committee is just a backbencher committee with no real power to move anything, to change anything. And so the question that came up for me, so what does this mean? If they have no power, if they're not likely to make any difference, did we need to bother? Could we afford to not bother? Could we afford to ignore these kinds of things? Any one of you can answer. Actually, I'd like both of you to answer that. What do you think?
If I could go first,
Mm-hmm.
all parliamentary committees have a purpose and a place in the makeup and running of the various parliaments. What we are experiencing with this invitation that has been provided to us, and I, hand on Bible, am not sure whether or not Turks and Caicos has made a submission. I very fortunately was in the BVI last week doing some post-parliamentary election training with the members there, so I'm unaware of whether TCI has made a formal recommendation. But generally, these sorts of parliamentary committees, and especially in Westminster, which created the idea of the scrutiny committees, does provide an opportunity for information to be collected, collated, as well as other works for it to take part in the review of, or the assistance of the review of whatever the committee's work is. In this regard, we are well aware that come November at the Joint Ministerial Council meeting, which is held in the United Kingdom, which would have all the heads of the overseas territories, there is constitutional discussions on the agenda. Different islands or different territories in our 14 family group have had different levels of constitutional review and instructions and discussions over the last few years. The most successful review that has recently taken place took place in the Cayman Islands. The Turks and Caicos Islands, from the end of our Commission of Inquiry phase into our representative government phase, has had the back and forth with the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office on constitutional reform and change. And we have been advised that this will be the topic of agenda in the bilateral meetings this November when our delegation heads to the United Kingdom. So I wouldn't agree with the gentleman who says that these committees are just a set of committees made up of backbenchers. There are more backbenchers than there are ministers in the English and Wales in the United Kingdom Parliament. Backbenchers have an amazing responsibility of shining light in areas where darkness seems to have creeped in, as well as their recommendations have to be noted by the government. And if this committee is as functioning as some of the other Westminster scrutiny committees are, there will be continuous updates to the recommendations and how they're being implemented by the respective governments. What I would have liked to see during this period, though, is that representatives from the committee would have visited the islands and also had these discussions. We are in the know because we are interested in our different territories' relationship with the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, that relationship has been strained over the years for different reasons, whether it's COI and BVI recently or COI a few years ago. TCI's newest struggle is unlawful immigration, where national external security is the responsibility of the United Kingdom. Yet, we are being forced to fund the repatriation of unlawful migrants into the territory with little to no support from the United Kingdom. And so the real discussion moving forward is, what does each territory really want their partnership and relationship with the United Kingdom to look like, versus all of us having the same constitution and given the illusion that we are happy working within the confines that have been provided to us versus the confines that may have been negotiated with us. And so, long story short, I do think the committee has teeth. I wish they would have had members come down to each territory to invite the discussion, to get firsthand evidence from the people in the territory, because again, those who are not interested in internal and external politics but may have a voice may not be aware that this review and evidence gathering session was underway. And last but not least, I would like to see, when the final report is laid in Parliament, how the government will respond to it, knowing that the British government is heading into an election year. And we know things tend to fall by the wayside in election years that do not affect the individualized constituencies in the United Kingdom. The overseas territories tend to get a back seat. And so those are the concerns I have with the current process, but I do believe the committee does have teeth. It's whether or not they decide to use them. Thank you, Shirley.
Sorry, I said Shirley.
Yeah.
I was trying to see if I could avoid echoes anywhere. Thanks for that. I'll remember next time. I was saying, let me switch this around a little bit for you, John. I take Akierra's point that we really cannot afford to ignore them. Even if it had not been on the agenda for JMC, these are things we can't afford to ignore. However, what do you say then to the notion that these are just formalities anyway, because Britain already has decided? Because that's another train of thought, and that might be the cynical one, but the thinking is that they've already decided. They know what they're going to do. This is just a formality. They know what they want before they ask us. They're just asking us just to make it sound like they're doing something, but nothing we say will matter. Do you think that's true?
I think there's always room for cynicism when it comes to politics. I'm getting quite a reverb as I speak here. That's a little better. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Okay. I was going to say that, there's the old saying that governments send things to committees and that's where they go to die. And committees have been used for that purpose in the past. But I tend to agree with Ms. Missick that, committees exist to give backbenchers an opportunity to shine and to cut their teeth. And I would like to think that those members of this committee are going to seize that opportunity, to press themselves forward, if not the issues that are raised. And of course, if they press themselves forward, along with them will come the issues that we raise. I don't think we can afford not to speak to these committees, because then they can probably say and would say, well, they're not too fussed, they're not too concerned, there's no need for us to do anything. And so I think it is incumbent on us to say something. In my particular case, I decided to share my thoughts through the local newspaper to get reaction, to stimulate some thought, and hopefully to prompt some people to make submissions themselves, because the announcement came out, I don't know, months ago, maybe certainly weeks ago, and people get preoccupied and they move on to other things. Constitutional issues don't tend to be high on the agenda, certainly here in Bermuda. And I think it's always good to stimulate and to have people look at their constitutions and the way things are working. In our case, the Bermuda Constitution order is dated 1968. There have been some amendments since. It's over 50 years old. The world, thought, and have moved on considerably since then. And it's incumbent on us. I don't think we necessarily have to depend on Britain. They can help facilitate, but it's incumbent on us to have our own constitution orders under review to see what changes we think there ought to be and what we ought to press Britain for. In my particular position on this is this, that in Bermuda, the last time we took a poll and have a referendum, the overwhelming majority are not in favor of independence. But that shouldn't stop us from reviewing the document. It is meant to be a living document, one that evolves. Indeed, Britain says that in the white papers that they've produced. And we should look at it and see how we can improve the way in which we govern ourselves and find out what it is that Britain is prepared to accommodate us on, what they are not prepared to accommodate us on, find out why, and then decide whether it is time to make other decisions. And so I think it was incumbent on us to take advantage of the opportunity, and I think we have every right to expect them to take what they have offered to us, that is our submissions, and listening to us. We should take them seriously and take them at their word, and I too would like to see what they produce at the end of the day.
Thank you, excellent. So before we go on any further, let me just drop in here a little bit of an explanation, backstory. Thanks for the reminder, Shaina, about why we're doing this, because I think it must be known. People need to be aware that every once in a while, every few years, something like this comes down from the United Kingdom. The question of the relationship between the overseas territories and the administering power. The last one, I think, was 2017, 18, 16, somewhere around there. And that had to do with some of the same questions, but not specifically constitutional. I think in the years since then, a lot has happened, including the troubles in Virgin Islands, that have sort of brought the idea of the constitution orders, the higher level laws under which we live. And then, of course, in Montserrat, we've had recently a governor who, the term that we use on Ireland, that interesting enough, she herself used the other day. I don't think she meant to, but she talked about interfering. I laughed at that because she has been accused of that, and she said she doesn't. But because so much in our constitutions is left to the discretion, up to the discretion of whoever the sitting governor is at the time. And so this request for submissions from the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, I agree that it's really important, and it has come out now. They'll be asking for submissions by the 4th of September. And I think this probably came out about 3-4 months ago. I think I saw this first round about June, July, somewhere around there. And that's
actually it's April.
April, yeah, okay. So they give you these few months to look at these things. And I'm hoping that people in all the territories are burying them in paperwork. And that's my advice to Montserrat. Everybody write to them, say what you think, because there's so much in these constitution orders that don't work. So that don't work for us. So the questions that they ask, I just briefly run through them as quickly as I can. They ask,
have them up on the screen.
Oh, you do? Okay, there you go. So there's a series of them. The constitutional arrangements, are they appropriate in the 21st century? And that was what we titled the conversations we had, the discussions we had between the hosted by the Montserrat Conference and the University of the West Indies Montserrat site. What is the UK government's relationship with the overseas territories? Now, that particular one, I think they need to respond. They need to answer. They shouldn't be asking us that. You tell us what your relationship is. We can answer the other one about how we feel the relationship is, but we have these series of white papers that very clearly declare how the United government feels about these territories, and many of us disagree about those. But then there are questions about the United Kingdom's parliament. And that's interesting because people tend to make a difference. People tend to not differentiate between the parliament and the government. And in Montserrat, we have that issue. The government is the executive, the parliament is the legislative body. They work together, but they're not the same thing. And they have different influences and different ways, different means of exerting their influence. How is legislation made? Legislation is made subject to the Westminster system of government that we have and these constitution orders that we've been given, and all of the aspects of that in terms of who signs off, who assents. Obviously, I think we all have the Secretary of State for the Crown, but you have the governors on island who ultimately are the ones who assent and who could, at least according to Montserrat's constitution, could refuse to sign off. And then they talk about mechanisms for, are effective mechanisms in place for the interests of the overseas territories to be represented internationally? This is an important one. I want us to talk about that a little bit today. But then the last question is, are the rights and interests of the British overseas territories effectively protected by the current constitutional arrangement? My response in my submission was, the long and short answer is no. And interestingly, I know somebody else who wrote pretty much the same thing. Because some of these questions, the response from us would be clear. Now, the conditionals around that, the context, I think it's important for us to tell them. So my answer didn't just stop at no, it was here's why. So there are all these questions that we're required to respond to. And like you said, John, very often the constitutional issues don't come up for people. They don't seem to be urgent or critical. In fact, when Montserrat got our constitution order in 2010, one of the complaints that still annoys us today, still boggles our minds today, is there was so little consultation. People were not engaged. It was 2009, 2010. We were dealing with the volcano and all that. And then there's also the notion that the government, neither ours nor the British government, actually made enough of an effort to get people involved. So these are things that I agree with you. The government really, the people who see the need really need to step out and pull people in and take the time that it needs to get them engaged. So that's where we are with this. That's part of why we're having this conversation. And we're having this conversation also because for us, these are important. And my particular position on all of these is that we need not, I agree with you, John. I think you said this, John. We don't need to wait for the British government to tell us what they want to ask us questions. We should be proactive. These are the things that we're interested in. These are things that we would like. Let us negotiate on those and not just react to what they send and tell us. So, the thing I want to say, go ahead, Shaina.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, let me share a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Mute your mic.
Yeah, let me do that.
Let me see if I can minimize this echo. Okay, great. So for us here in the Virgin Islands, I actually was part of a panel discussion last week, Monday, as far as it relates to, the inquiry that's going on, because I realized, as everyone has said, there was not enough public consultation happening through whether it's the government or even local groups to inform persons to make sure, everyone was aware of what is happening. And I find it's been the same thing over the last series of white papers in terms of it's put out since April, but we were in the middle of an election cycle at that point as well. So it would have been for the new government now to raise the public awareness about this and do the education. And, one of the things that the panel we were saying, similar to what you're saying, Shirley, is that, not enough. I think one of our key things is we don't teach civics in our school system anymore. So basic constitutional knowledge is something that the average citizen does not have. So oftentimes, there's even that difficulty of saying, let's have a conversation about, what the current constitutional arrangement is. And what does it mean for your daily life? Because, I always tell people politics is about the quality of your life. These are the decisions being made that you feel on a daily basis. But sometimes, again, because that basic understanding isn't done from early ages all the way up now. So as an adult now, it's just a matter of it continuing to evolve and the understanding expand. Because even with some of the questions where it's asking, how, what was it? I think is the relationship of the UK Parliament and the overseas territories. And I was pointing out to someone, I say, we have to be very careful with the semantics that are being used, because technically the overseas territories are not a part of the United Kingdom. We're not considered a part of it. And that is why, monikers as overseas territory family and, global Britain are being used, because we're not in the parliament, because technically we're not part of the UK Parliament. And all the other countries, which are England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, would be represented. So these are the things that, again, basic knowledge that's not there. And I think for us as we're at a disadvantage now when it comes to having these conversations, to not have more persons, participating willingly, and then, as Honorable Barritt said, jumping at the opportunity when they do come, to make sure that our opinions are essentially registered. And I like the idea that Honorable Missick mentioned in terms of, the committee actually touching down and going into the communities for which you are asking. Because even, when we were responding to the questions, we were saying, we need to really make this specific, where we can't speak on behalf of Bermuda, TCI, Cayman, Montserrat, and Anguilla. Everybody has to speak to their own situation. But how this is phrased is as if we're lumped all together as a block, knowing full well that even at a constitutional order level, we all have different constitutions. And that was one of the things that came very blaring to me when we were doing all constitutional reform coming out of the COI. Actually, it started before, but with the COI, it was one of the second priority recommendations that was made. So it was something now, I started digging in and comparing. And when I looked at TCI, Cayman, and the Virgin Islands, completely, we're on completely different stages, but we're all considered overseas territory. So that for me was something right off the bat, that with this inquiry, I do hope that, everybody shares that, if we are going to look at it, we need to discuss why we are on different standing points. So for example, our governor has all the vested executive authority. In Cayman, it is in the government. So that is a completely different standing when it comes to, who is governing the country. Whether your elected government has more say than the governor, or there's some kind of check and balance of power, so to speak. So I'll pause there and listen more for you guys.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that issue of the governors, of sort of standardizing some parts, the basic parts of our constitution orders, I think it's an important one, because to my mind, there are certain things that are just foundational, fundamental, that should just be. We talk about human rights. There are some inalienable human rights. It's the same thing, and the constitution order is a higher order, is the highest order legislation in the land. And at the same time, Britain has these constitution orders have to allow for our differences, our cultural differences. Yes. In Montserrat, the governor doesn't have a vote in cabinet, but it's the governor who convenes cabinet, and the governor sits in cabinet. And then you get a governor who exercises her prerogatives to override whatever, or to step out, and you get in trouble. So one of the questions I want to talk about the being represented internationally. But before I do that, I wanted to ask about self-determination, because one of the reasons I think why our people don't get, well, at least that's the case in Montserrat, and I've heard other people in other territories talk about this. One of the reasons why our people are not so much engaged in the constitution discussions is because they figure a lot of it is a done deal anyway. Self-determination, independence, autonomy, what do these things mean? And so if we're going to be colonies and overseas territories, do the details really matter? Do the details really touch people's day-to-day lives? So talk to me, John and Akierra, about what this means. What do your people understand about self-determination? Go ahead, Akierra.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I was having a little audio trouble there, but I think I am back. So in the Turks and Caicos, after our period of troubles, or during the period of troubles, there was a lot of talk about it's time for full self-determination, possibly independence, because the idea that in 2009, order can come from a country that's 4,000 miles away sent the crack of dawn that representative politics is now no longer available to a people in a country, despite it being a territory, was unfathomable. And so that created a lot of distrust as it came to our relationship with the United Kingdom. The reasons why the suspension of our constitution took place, the lengthy 7, almost 10-year trial now that has been underway, which has not yet concluded and is subject to the taxpayers in the Turks and Caicos Islands purse, public purse. So when those discussions of self-determination were happening back then, the idea was to try and strive for some full autonomy similar to that of our colleagues and brothers and sisters in Bermuda. I know John says that their constitution is from the 1960s, but when you look at the 14 overseas territories, despite the fact that us in the Atlantic and Caribbean region have more of a connection through territories talk, through integration, through visiting each other and working more closely together than we would say Gibraltar or our colleagues down in the Falkland Islands, the gold standard was Bermuda, where your elected government would advise the crown, the governor, of the decisions they've made, but not seek confirmation or acceptance of those decisions by that body or by that person, by that office. And so that's where we were in Turks and Caicos thinking where we should go post-commission of inquiry. Unfortunately, when the constitutional order of 2011 came into effect after a tumultuous consultation process. I mean, I remember crowds of people attending the constitutional talks meetings. I remember many little riots being formed where persons were blocking the road because the idea that England, the United Kingdom, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, technocrats in the British Civil Service would dictate to us how we should live and operate our lives in our territory, again, was unfathomable in 2010, 2011. This is the 2000s that we're dealing in. This is not the early 1900s. And so in that regard, what self-determination means to us is the full ability to have the rights to vote for persons who will be able to implement policies, plans, and procedures without by the United Kingdom. So an instance, post-commission of inquiry for us, our budget needed to have FCDO approval and review. There were parameters for which we could operate in. There were targets that were set by the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. They would say in conjunction with us, but at the end of the day, they had the full veto power to say yes or no. So that, in our view, is not full self-determination. Obviously, independence will be the ultimate level of self-determination. But unlike Cayman Islands, our current constitution doesn't even provide that level of referendum to poll the electorate and or the residents that are living here, whether or not that is an area that they would like to see the Turks and Caicos Islands progress in. So in the instance where persons feel that the Constitution is so far removed from them, they feel that way until one of their constitutional rights are trampled on. And then it's, well, why hasn't this been fixed? Why hasn't the elected government resolved this issue? Well, in putting out all the fires that you do in small territories, things like the Constitution, as John said, falls away, because it isn't a day-to-day fire that needs addressing, but it needs a concerted effort. It needs the energy behind it, and the people have given the mandate to their elected government and opposition, because you have to do it in tandem with the entire House of Assembly or Parliament to have these discussions and move it forward. And I'm hoping that our submission that we have made, not to the committee, because as I said earlier, the Turks and Caicos is currently in a constitutional discussion with the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. We have made a formalized legal representation by hiring Sir Jeffrey Jowl to assist at Cayman Islands and their review 2 years ago, and making the submission for the Turks and Caicos Islands. But again, it all comes back to what is the relationship with the United Kingdom going to look like for us? And until we decide how that relationship should look, then the Constitution still will not be something that will be beneficial to all of us in our territories, if it's something that is imposed on us versus something negotiated with us.
Yeah. Thank you. Shaina, I want to ask you a question, but let me ask John. I want to ask a question about the constitutional reform, but let me ask John first. The same question, except with the other consideration that Bermuda is, quote unquote, a rich country. Bermuda has a higher GDP per capita than Britain. Bermuda's GDP per capita is around $81,000, and the United Kingdom is $41,000. So if economics were the foundation under which people would finally say, you know what, we've had enough of this yoke, we want to move, we want to be able to make our own decisions, we want independence, Bermuda could technically, theoretically, in actual fact, go choose independence. But in Bermuda, the push for independence has not had much success. Why might that be, do you think? Unmute, John, please.
Thank you. That's not an easy question to answer. I think there are, lots of speculation as to why. And I think to a large extent, it's because Bermudians tend to vote, this is my opinion, pragmatically, with at least one eye on their pocketbook. And there's the old expression, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I that's just a generalization, but one that I think is apt. What I'd like to say, to a point that Shaina raised as well, and I think this is true in politics, and you shouldn't beat yourself up when people don't get engaged on constitutional issues. I think the best way to put it is this way, that voters are more interested in the brownie than they are in the recipe that makes the brownie. They get interested in the recipe when the brownie doesn't come out right, when there's something wrong with it. And that's when I think people start to get engaged on constitutional issues and matters of governance. I can tell you as a legislator in 18 years, and particularly when I moved from government to opposition, I was keen to see us reform the rules under which we operate, which is not something that relies on Britain. But even some of my own colleagues used to say, oh, Barritt, you're wasting your time. This is not what's important to the people. Well, it isn't important to the people directly, but it is important as to how we govern ourselves and then how we govern the country. And it's incumbent on us to do something about that. And no, it won't make a sexy headline. It may not get you out front of the crowd, but it is an important contribution to make. And you're right, Ms. Missick, that our Constitution back in 1968 was considered very progressive in its time. And I think you'd have to, and I touched upon this the last time we spoke, was that you have to put it in the context and you have to look at history. What is curious about that time when Bermuda representatives went to Britain to get a constitution and to develop responsible government as opposed to representative government, you had there the Progressive Labor Party, which was newly formed and was looking to reform the country in a big way. I mean, we were moving from segregation not having a universal adult suffrage. And they were at the forefront of pushing for change. And the merchant class, I'm going to call them that, the business community that ran Bermuda up to that point as independence, they both had an interest in making sure that Bermuda could govern itself as much as possible, so i.e. have as much self-government as possible. So while they may have had different views on, what the Constitution should look like and how far it should go, and there were some sticking points, like in the makeup of constituencies and boundaries, they did agree on one thing: we want to get as much self-control, self-government as possible. And that's why the government you find in the Constitution, more limited in scope and power than in other jurisdictions. That's, again, my opinion as I look back on it. And I was only a young man at the time, but I have had a keen interest, both as a journalist and as then as a member of parliament and as a lawyer, in looking back on these things. And I think what it's going to take, to get people engaged, and you look sometimes to the organizations in your community, people who are advocates or advocacy groups. Some of them have special interests, but they ought to be given the opportunity to get involved as well. And that's a point I made when I made my submission to the committee, is that, look, we've moved on so far from 1968. There are other groups that can be invited to sit around the table, can be invited to share their views on what's missing and what should be there. And we don't have to necessarily limit it, with all due respect, to the two political parties or three political parties. It should be open to everyone to get engaged. And technology, as an example this evening, makes that possible, and we should take full advantage. Now, you asked about self-determination. I think for most Bermudians now, self-determination probably comes down to independence, whether we should take the final step and go independent. And in my submission, I said to the Foreign and Commonwealth, to the Public Administration Committee, I think it's incumbent upon the UK government to say where they stand on this issue. What will they regard as a territory deciding it's going to have self-determination? Is it going to be by way of referendum? I think most of us assume that to be the case, but I've never seen a definitive statement to that effect. Personally, I think that's the purest way of doing it, and I'm all in favor of self-determination and letting people decide. But as I say, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I just want to say that when I look at what we have today, I want to push Britain, and this is what I did in my submissions. What are you prepared to grant us now as we remain under our constitution order? And we've got to press to find out where they stand so we can make decisions on where we need to go and how far we need to go. And I have to say, Ms. Missick, since we've had that constitution, while there are a number of things still in the governor's discretion, over time, practices have evolved. You might even upgrade them to conventions where the governor consults. Like, let's take, for instance, the appointment of our Chief Justice or the Police Commissioner and Public Service Commission. There are bodies that have been set up which are consulted to make sure, like in the case of the Chief Justice, the local bar association and others, who make a recommendation to the governor. So it's not a decision that the governor, he or she can make it on their own, but they've set up bodies by which there is consultation. And in some cases, consultation is required under our Constitution in any event. But these are sort of conventions, and talking about international relations, and Phil Parentchief, the former AG, spoke to this. Entrustments have developed whereby Bermuda can sit at the table in its own right, or as much as an overseas territory can sit in its own right around the conference table and make representations and speak. And that's developed over the years as well. So there have been these advances that haven't required amendments to our Constitution. But I'm a firm believer that parliamentary democracies work. There are also questions of law. So when there are disputes, they can be settled by the courts, and that you don't necessarily want to leave it just to convention. If this is the right thing to do, let's enshrine it in writing and have it in our Constitution order, as people refer to it here, our Constitution. Well, it's a constitutional order, but let's not get into nomenclature tonight. All right, I'll stop there.
Constitution order, not constitution. I'm with you on that. Shaina, tell us of what's going on in the beach. Somebody just made a comment about the idea that there's a governor being sent into a post-colonial world is an anachronism. The question is, are we actually post-colonial? I guess that is what it boils down to. But Shaina, I know that when your troubles started, one of the issues that we heard around the islands was, one of the problems was that your then premier had in his campaign, in his election promises, had election promises, yeah, had talked about constitutional reform. And of course, some of the stories are that this is one of the reasons why Britain is being so heavy-handed now. What is how are the Virgin Islands handling this now? Are people getting engaged? Because there's the COI and all that, and everybody knows about that. But are you still having trouble getting people engaged? And the idea of self-determination, where they're standing on that, and how, in terms of John talked about polls, or was it? Oh, I didn't put a note. It might have been Akierra. Somebody talked about polling for find out how interested people are about it. Yeah, how is that going in the Virgin Islands?
Well, it's been a journey, and I will make it short, because for me, from 20 years ago, if we really pay attention to what's been happening in the Virgin Islands in terms of our government, 2002, we had issues where the financial secretary at the time was arrested. 10 years later, we ended up being forced to sign off on protocols for good financial management, and some amendments were made. So it's something where, the leashes and the shackles and everything have been being put back on, until we got to the place of, in 2019 was the election before the one this year. And yes, the conversations around decolonization became, I think, a lot louder, because back in 2019 was when we had the threat of an order in council, if not that it was actually done, as it relates to pushing a public beneficial ownership registry. And that for me was when I think the outcry, the public outcry, became really loud about, hey, we can't continue to go down this road where someone feels that if what we're doing violates their interest or is against their interest, then our interests basically are subverted. So, and knowing now too, 2023, we are right here on when the deadline was given to the OTs at the time, in terms of the discussion of making this public beneficial ownership right, because it was, if you don't do it, we're gonna make it a law for you, So that is where I think, the 2020 conversations started, where we had a commission put together for constitutional reform, because our last constitution is 2007, so we are overdue to move forward and progress things, and in terms of where we need to be going for greater governance. So apart from the issues with the public sector reform, and to me that is a whole separate discussion, and what a lot of the COI missed in my mind, because I understand the mechanism and the machinery that moves the country is all found in the public service. And a lot of things that may not have been a matter of legality were because there weren't any rules or proper systems and processes set up within the public service system to help rein in and bring good governance into effect. And, we can't miss the fact that all of these things fall under the purview of the governor. So, when you don't have good governance in a country, it is not just entirely up to, the elected government saying, they haven't done what they were supposed to do, when you are part and parcel of making sure, or the accountability and the transparency structure that should be taking place over these last 20 years. So there were those of us that we joined in the conversation from 2020 talking about decolonization. We had persons like Dr. Caroline Corbin come in on different occasions to speak to, looking at or evaluating the Constitution against the United Nations Decolonization Charter, and just on 11 indicators to say, do you have a self-governing structure? Because it's interesting that on the same webpage for this committee, they're saying that they have 10 self-governing OTs. But based on our evaluation that was done, the government hired Dr. Corbin to do this. We are a far cry from what should be in place or should be being walked towards through a work program. And one of the things that he enlightened us on, that I was shocked to see, was that back in 1986, apparently the UK wrote to the C24 Committee of the United Nations and told them, essentially, if the OTs aren't asking for decolonization, then we're not going to do it. We're not going to push it. But if they do want to go independent, essentially the door is there. So that has been so in my mind, I was like, oh, well, this explains why where we are where we are, where if we don't take the initiative, in terms of making this happen for ourselves, understanding what our options are, we can't wait on them to do it because the current status quo suits them, and I keep explaining this to persons that clearly in our constitution, it says that if the UK, no, it says the sovereign interest, it conflicts with the local interest. Basically, the sovereign interest, is superseded. So, the moniker of modern partnership, I'm like, there's no way you could have a modern partnership if that is the framework that we are being governed by.
Yeah. So let me ask one more question. This might be the last question, Shaina. You tell me how we're doing for time. And I want to ask of the three of you, because following on the comment that was made, which came in from Montserrat, by the way, the issue of a governor. Do we need a governor? The governor acts for the crown through the Secretary of State and so on. In this day and age, do we need a governor doing what they, because if you think the constitution orders and the orders from the United Kingdom come through and managed by, controlled by the governor, yes? If not the governor, then what? On what could our relationship hinge if there weren't a governor? And when I'm thinking about this, what's coming to my mind, conversations had over the last years about there being the territories having elected representatives in the House of Commons, which I think was rejected by at least all of the overseas territories pretty much. So do we need a governor to do what the governor is doing? And if not a governor, then what? I want the three of you to answer that, please.
Well, my view is based on the fact that I've worked with 5 governors since I've entered frontline politics and been the representative of the amazing constituency of Leeward and Long Bay. And it comes down to a simple answer is no. I don't believe we need governors in our territories, but if we are to have them in order to ensure that the relationship is a genuine partnership with the United Kingdom, because we decide to remain as United Kingdom overseas territories, then the style of governorship needs to change to become more integrated as a partnership. Over the years, I've had the ability to see strong-willed governors, and I've also had the ability to work with you're the elected governors, and so I'm here to accept your advice. Having a governor is like being a 25-year-old working, making your own money, paying your own bills, but still calling your mom to ask your mom if you can go over to your friend's house and negotiate a deal with your friend. The remit of the governors in our territories, and I'll stick to Turks and Caicos in this regard, is primarily functions of external matters. So any negotiations the Turks and Caicos Islands government wishes to have with the Bahamas, with the government of Jamaica, tends to need the blessing of the FCDO if it relates to migration, external security matters, whether we can enter into contracts to protect our borders, which are very porous and almost on a daily basis now being inundated with the landings of illegal migration. In order to enter into agreements with the Bahamas to assist us and the US Coast Guard to assist us, we needed to have the blessing from the FCDO because that is a reserved power of the governor. I'm okay with that if the funding is also coming with that authority. It is not coming with that authority. So in essence, the decisions that are being made in this territory or on this territory's behalf is being funded by the taxpayers in this territory. And they are the ones who should have the ultimate say at the end of the day by casting their ballot. Now, again, in the Turks and Caicos context, our constitution for the House of Assembly is also very unique compared to our other colleagues in the region. Our House of Assembly, albeit it's a unicameral system, so unlike Bermuda, we do not have a Senate, we do have the ability for the governor to appoint 2 independent members of their choosing to give a different sort of ideology, and flavor of the House of Assembly makeup outside of party politics. Now, that is something that I am definitely not in favor of, as I am a Republican and I believe in the casting, and I don't mean United States Republican, I mean the ideology behind being a Republican, of the electorate having the ability to make the decisions by voting for their representatives to be responsible leaders and legislators, administrators of the country's affairs. But having an external party who is selected, by which means we are still unsure about, having them visit the territory 3 months clandestinely to get a feel for the territory, then receiving a briefing note from the outgoing member, the outgoing governor. So they're already coming in with a rose-colored glasses as to life in the islands or life in the territories, and then coming in with their own agenda that is not made clear on day one, but can be seen over the course of their governorship, is not fair to those who have to or who have the ability to vote, because they are not voting for this person. Yet in a Turks and Caicos context, this person is the president of cabinet. They can veto legislation that the House of Assembly could approve, amend in the parliament, then it goes up for assent and is not signed off. Those sorts of veto powers are appropriate, but not for someone who's external from the territory. If it's the case that in order to have this relationship with the United Kingdom be maintained, then we need to look at how we could chip away at some of the executive functions that a governorship would have and place that with the elected representatives so that the people of the territories can feel and know that they have buy-in at the executive level right to the top versus buy-in at the executive level, but 2 levels below governor and deputy governor when it comes to the ultimate veto power. And so that is the position that I would take. No, moving forward, we don't need a governor, but if there is a need for a governorship, that office needs to be redesigned where they have less administrative functions, less executive functions, and more ceremonial functions to represent the crown and His Majesty in the islands or territories.
Thank you. What do you think, John and Akierra? And what about the notion that if we must have these governors, we, the elected officials, ought to have some say in who they are. So when they get shortlisted, if we must have them, shouldn't we be involved in the final selection? What do you both think?
Your question, your initial question, Shirley, was a provocative one, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, as whether we really need a governor. I take a different approach, and I did in my submissions. Look, I want to know, and Honorable Ms. Missick put it this way, we chip away at the powers of the governor. I want to know what the UK is prepared to allow by way of devolution, let's say, in terms of those powers, based on our experiences to date, particularly in Bermuda. I can't speak for the other territories, but they've been spoken for tonight in 2 cases. There are some changes we'd like to see to start with. And it would be, and that's why I think it's incumbent on us to press the UK on what they're prepared to evolve in terms of powers of the governors, because the governor, as it currently stands in our constitutional order, does some important things. And some of those things are sort of removed from the political process somewhat. That is the appointment of judges. And we may want to consider, and I'm not saying we're going to decide one way or the other, whether we want to keep that in place. And then if we are going to keep it in place, who is going to exercise that function that heretofore has been done by the governor? And that's where I think we need to start turning our attention. And we can do that. We don't need a UK parliamentary committee or the FCO or anyone else. We can take our case to them. That's where I come out, because when I first started writing in my submission, I said, look, back in 2012, and I'm reading what I quoted from the white paper then, they said the overseas, the committee said that, no, the paper said at that time, is that the time is not right to embark on a further round of constitutional change after a decade of constitutional change. That's in 2012. As I say, it's certainly been a lot of time that's passed since then, and not only time, so too has thinking. And not just in the overseas territories, but in other, independent democratic countries as to how things can be improved. And what they also said in that paper was that it was not unreasonable to expect constitutions to evolve and require adjustment in light of circumstances. Well, isn't that the very thing we're saying needs to occur now? And we should take advantage of that. I mean, I don't want to go too far down off track or sidetrack, but I look at what's happening in Canada, and just to give you a slight, for instance, they have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which enshrines constitutional rights and allows people to take their governments to court and challenge things. There are two groups now that are challenging the first past the post electoral system. And the reason why is because they say that the legislature, or in their case, parliament, is meant to be supreme. But the way things have evolved over the years, parliament is really a rubber stamp or an echo chamber, because they're dictated to by the executive, and parliaments are not functioning like they ought to in reviewing legislation and holding the executive to account. So they're challenging the first past the post electoral system, saying that we maybe in order to give expression to people's will, we need to go to proportional representation. I think that's what they're saying. And they're saying that will entail more collaboration, and people will be more represented in Parliament, and Parliament is more likely to perform its function then as the overseeing body of the executive. And that's an interesting development, not one that I saw coming, but there you have it. And they're taking it to court to try and have that argument. And I cite that only as an example of how thinking develops and evolves over time. And we're not exempt. I mean, yes, we may be overseas territories, but we are fully functioning human beings in this world who know a lot about what's going on in the world and what needs to be changed and how things can be improved. And we've got to give voice to that.
Yeah. Shaina, and I think this is our last question. You just gave me time. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with everything that they've said. And to add to it, that because we have such unique situations, like, for example, I think TCI and Bermuda, they appointed judges. But here in the Virgin Islands, we're part of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court system. So, and I think Montserrat is the same way. So it's so many things in terms of our governance currently that we have to truly look at when we talk about the decolonization side of things. What would be that basic platform that we all want to move towards? And as Honorable Barritt said, look at the devolution of powers as that progressive move towards self-governance, and how it will all pan out for all of us. Because I think, especially as international participants in the global economy, all of our countries, we're not, sheltered anymore as we were probably back in the 1800s. And even then, that was still international trade that was happening, where we were supporting the European continent. So it's something where for us, as a people, we have to start to truly take this very seriously in terms of where we see ourselves in the next 25 years and start to make those decisions now, or at least have the hard conversations. Because I know there's a lot of sentiment here around being a part of the monarchy and what that means for them. But we also have to, dive into what does it mean for us to actually have control of our own destiny. And, we had a bicameral system here again prior to 1901 when our constitution was actually revoked by the Leeward Island Federation. So that was one of the things that we suffered from in terms of setback in our political progression, in my mind, where, it just came back as a unicameral, and it was sort of an advisory body to the governor at the time. And with that, now it's been really a push to try to get the devolution of powers and where is that next stage. So I completely agree with putting the ball back in their court and saying, we've matured. Yes, we made mistakes, but we have a plan now that we're saying this is how we plan to improve our systems for overall good governance, not just accountability, transparency, but making sure now that there's more participation, there's more inclusion, better rule of law. All of us have challenges, including the UK, and it is for us to learn from each other. And as a result of that, all come out stronger and better on the other end, on behalf of our people, because really and truly that is who these conversations are about, the quality of life of the people within these territories and what the generations to come now are going to be able to inherit.
Thank you. My take on that is, we don't need a governor, but the some of the functions of the governor, like John said, the ceremonial functions, they're cool to watch, they're cool to have, they're important in societies. And me, because I'm an anti-monarchist, the notion of the unearned privilege, you're born into privilege, and that allows you to, manage and dictate and own people's lands and so on, is anathema to me. I reject that in total. But I do recognize that somebody there who, just like Akierra said, and you, Shaina, somebody who understands the context, understands the country, somebody who understands the people, knows what they're working with, and who is supportive and helpful, not an overseer, not somebody who operates the way so many of our governors tend to do. And I really, really believe that in any case, when this person is being assigned, being put into office, that the elected members, the country, the territory ought to have some say in who that is. So you shortlist them, and then when the three best candidates are there, then we get to participate. Because that's what democracy is about. That's what post-colonial means. And just like John says, we are fully capable of running our country. We are fully capable of doing the things that we need to do. You said, Shaina, Britain has a problem. We are no more, literally, absolutely no more corrupt, incapable, unschooled than Britain. And so therefore, we have a right to be allowed to determine who we want to be and where we want to go. So thank you all very, very, very much. It's really good to talk to you again. We must do this some more. I think it's really important that these conversations are had and that expand. And that's what Territory is talking about. So Shaina.
Okay. So just to wrap up again, thank you to our guests. Thank you to all our viewers and those who will be viewing or listening later on through our media partners. Of course, we cannot do this without them. Cayman Marl Road Facebook page, Radio TCI, Montserrat ZJB Radio, Virgin Islands, CBN Radio FM 90.9, Bermuda's Channel 82, Radio Saba, PJFE FM 93.9, and Barbados CBC Channel 8. If you are for the first time tuning in, be sure to go and like our Facebook page, follow us on our YouTube channel, and you will be able to, whenever we have notices basically saying that we are going to be on, you guys will be able to know when we're back. So again, as you said, Shirley, we have to continue this conversation because, again, this is just the beginning of this process of the conversation around, yes, the UK is paying closer attention now to this. We are going to lend our voices to the conversation and make sure that it continues until we see the change and the improvements that we want to see within our countries, because we deserved it, and I think it's something that we're championing for and that we are able to accomplish. So on behalf of all our co-hosts, I just want to thank you again for tuning in and being here, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.